Hello, and welcome to another episode of In Progress. I'm so excited to be here tonight with our guest, Hal Arnold. Welcome, Hal. How are
Hey,
you?
good. How are you?
Wonderful. If you just want to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you write, we would love to hear it.
Absolutely. Well, my name is Hal, and I write sci-fi stories. My first book, We Who Paved the Milky Way, is a sci-fi dystopian story, but I write all across the genre. Um, that's just a little bit about me.
Yeah, I love that cover, by the way. It's just so
Thank
dreamy with
you.
that retro type feel, but yeah, I love it. So what got you started into writing?
So that's actually really funny because I ended up talking about that outside of this today. And the answer is that I just loved to tell stories.
Mm.
And when I was on the bus, it started just in elementary school. I used to just tell stories to the kids on the bus around me. And it's so funny, but I actually have the notebook that
Oh my
I
gosh.
originally told stories in. And it's so funny. It's set up, it's got the back has a rating, which is hilarious because I was 6. And it says it's rated 9 and up on the back.
I love
We've
that.
got chapters, and the whole little notebook is just
Oh, wow.
like little 6-year-old me. This is what I did for fun. So it started there. And then I wrote my first book for 10 years before getting it published. And that's what turned into this. And now
Nice.
my next books aren't taking nearly as long.
Right. I feel like, yeah, getting started versus keeping going is a vast different experience. And that's a great thing to talk about because one thing that what we're talking about today is writing processes. And one thing I've noticed for me is that I feel like my writing process is constantly evolving and changing from book to book, whether I'm writing short stories or novels. But first, how would you talk about writing processes to begin with? If you were just sit down and explain to someone what is writing process, how would you explain it?
Right. So I think that looks different for every genre.
Yeah.
And I think I would say it's almost genre specific. So
Mm.
for what I do a lot of the time, which is high sci-fi, high fantasy, where you want to start is world building, and then kind of decide what kind of characters would be necessary in this world and what kind of characters need a story told in our world. And that's kind of where you link the two and merge it together, and start the writing process. So for me, it starts with world building, like world mapping. I actually have you can't see, but on the other side of this room, I have sticky notes that say world build. And then there's rows that say planet, there's religion, people, culture, and it goes through that. And I just have tons of different, for every planet I create as a sci-fi author,
Yeah.
there's all of these things listed under it, even if the planet is completely insignificant. So
Right. So I think it's safe to say that you're a plotter.
I dabble a little bit in both.
Right.
Sometimes it starts from a spontaneous story, and then I kind of pull back and do the world building.
Okay.
But I definitely love a good plot, like a
Right.
good plotting time. That's good for me.
Yeah, I find it fun to discover your story before you tell it, because I know a lot of pantsers are like, oh, it's so fun to discover as you go, and I agree. I think everyone's a hybrid of both, right? I think
Mm.
that's the spectrum, and everyone is kind of a little bit of both. But yeah, I find sitting down and discovering the plot for myself is so exciting. So I really love plotting for that reason because yeah, I think it's so much fun. So what does your personal process look like? You start with world building and kind of delve into it, but what kind of questions do you ask yourself?
So that's actually a kind of a big thing of mine. I know you can't
Mm.
read this map, and that was intentional, because
Oh.
this is a secret project over here. But it does say, for example, this is the title of the book, and then around it'll say main plot points, important
Okay,
things that
cool.
are going to be happening, And then questions that I'm still not sure. So like this is why the science would work
Okay.
for different
Yeah.
things, different like
Mhm.
mechanisms in the world. Um, but a lot of the questions I'm asking is the the fundamental things that would make
Mm.
you fall in love
Mhm.
with a person, with a story, with a world. So one of the
Right.
things I like to do is I think everybody's kind of done the 50 questions to fall in love.
Right.
And a lot of people do them with their partner. I do this with each and every one of my characters.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
because if my audience can't fall in love with this character, that means I haven't succeeded.
Right.
And occasionally with a side character, I get we don't need to be that hard on it.
Right.
But for all of the main characters that have some type of story plot, it makes them feel more rounded. Especially when you have to try to like anticipate what will be the reaction here. Will it be
Right.
fear? Will it be excitement? Will it be like any other reaction that could happen? So
Mhm.
that's kind of a little bit of what I do with that.
Yeah, that's a really good point though, like that you want your characters to be relatable. Like that whole idea of you want a reader to be able to fall in love with them, like they have to be able to relate to them and understand them, whether they like them or not, you still want a character to be like seem like a human being to
Right.
your reader.
Exactly.
So I think that's a fantastic point. Like characters to me, I think are just as important, if not like for personally like me slightly more important than plot ideas, because to me like motivations of the characters, for example, is going to just help decide what the plot is going to be, because if the
Mm-hmm.
character, what they want and why they want it, is going to make like help me decide what they're going to do in certain situations and things. What's interesting to me is it seems like you are very like kind of analog, like you have the sticky notes on the wall, you have the poster board behind you, and you like mind map on it. I love that. Do you feel like there is an advantage to doing things like written out versus like brainstorming digitally, for example, like on a Google Doc?
I think it's really different depending on the person.
Right.
There's 100% advantages for me. I've always been the type that if I write something down, I remember it more.
Oh.
But also, I like images as well. And obviously,
Mhm.
not everyone is the type that likes to do images or even likes to draw or anything like that.
Right.
But I feel like this is kind of a good example of kind of what I mean here. This is a character I've been working on for a sci-fi comedy podcast that I'm collabing on.
I love
Um,
that.
but I kind of like find the vibe of the character as I draw them. And then I don't
Right.
forget what's going on. So I just like things on paper. And then as you read around it, you would find like the very basic things about them.
Right.
Kind of like how I feel like they would hold themselves, like different things like that. And then from that, I slowly start to grow like what would they do in this scenario? What is like
Mm.
they care about most, which is something that would destroy them if they lost. Like those are the things I start working on later. Thank you.
Those are really great drawings. Yeah, I love them. I think that, yeah, if you can't draw, there's things like Pick Crew where you can
Oh,
like
for sure.
you make avatars of your characters and stuff like that. I love technology nowadays allows us to do so much, where like if you don't have the skill for drawing, there's AI, there's so much you can do to still help you visualize and picture your characters, which really helps me out because I don't visualize
Mm.
in my brain. So it's like, when I think of like, okay, like what kind of nose would they have? Like it really helps me to like see a visual of it. Um, so I love that you draw your characters out. And I think it's fascinating that like what you choose to brainstorm about, like how they hold themselves. So many people forget about the importance of body language
Mhm.
in expressing who your character is, but also like different situations. But like if your character is a little shy or introverted, that like they might have that slump to their shoulders, they might have that little like downturn, fingers, hands clasped kind of thing, that like a lot of people just like don't add those little details into their story always. So I love that you think about that like first, or like from day one, when you're building your character up. What other like kind of details do you find yourself plotting out before you get started like that?
So I think there's a lot with what you just said there. Of course, you want
Mhm.
to know what their body language is like. But to add on to that, just kind of to say what other details. Um, One thing that I think is very important, I once heard a quote that said, "Your characters need to be predictable.
Mhm.
Your plot does not." Um,
Right.
in the way that you want the reader to be surprised by the plot, not by what the character does. So, like, you should expect that for the most part, unless, of course, it's an unreliable narration, that's different.
Mhm.
But for the most part, you know how the characters are going to react. So, mannerisms are incredibly important to me. Um, I line out catchphrases. I
Mhm.
line out of course all the larger ones where it's maybe favorite holidays, important family members, their relationships to each character, all of
Yes.
that as well. One of my favorite things that I did of my characters is I take each one, I fill it with a page, and then I write every other character they interact with in the book. And
Okay.
then I write how they met and their relationship with the character, what they're likely to do with the character, where they see eye to eye, where they don't, how they juxtapose each other. I do that for every single character in the book, starting from the main character in the circle.
Okay. And
Um,
how do you organize all your notes? Sorry to interrupt.
I actually, it's so funny that you asked this question because
Mhm.
I have a notebook that's specifically meant for doing just that purpose.
Right. Mhm.
And I could not find the one that was for the first book.
Ah, right. Okay.
So because of that, I'm unorganized about my organization.
Oh, no
um,
worries. Yeah.
but the general organization is to put it in one single notebook, and
Okay.
then everything that's about that book goes in one notebook.
Mhm.
I do keep things on the walls, and it kind of looks like a madman's office. But
With all like the
I
string and those
do
big
that for
notes.
sure.
I love that.
There's a lot of sticky notes all over the place.
Oh, that's wonderful though. I feel like it gives your room character. Literally
I feel that
character.
way.
Yeah, I'm sure people living with you may not feel the same, but I love it for
It's
you.
my office. They can
Yeah. Yeah, they can stay out, right? No, I love that. I also do something similar, but I had to stop using notebooks and switch to a binder because I would like fill notebooks and then like have a notebook for each book and then be like, crap, what page is this information on that I need? So I love binders now because I'm like, I can file it and know that like this section is for the world building, this section is for the characters and all that stuff. So that's really helped me a lot because I would be like, I know I took notes on this, but I could never find them because I'm so
I do
random.
kinda like color coding in the notebook to kinda like
Oh,
make it
nice.
happen.
Yeah. That's
But
great. Yeah. Yeah. That's a
sometimes
great
a
idea.
color dies or a cat tosses the pen underneath the
Right.
couch, and then, no more of that color.
No more of that color. Yeah. Yeah. All your cats. Right. So how did you figure out what your writing process was and like what works best for you?
Hmm. Well, that was a pretty long process.
Mhm.
My first book, I actually started writing it in the sixth grade.
Oh,
The version that exists of it now is definitely a graduated college version. But the very first draftings of it and the character creation and all that happened back then. So for the first book, it was very chaotic.
oh no.
I actually wrote every scene of the first book only when I had a strong emotion. And then I would write whatever scene I wanted. And it was very
Mhm.
Panster style.
Right.
And then because of that, I had to go back and do the intense world building that I do now.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's kind of what developed my style was I had written this book, which almost had been originally set up as a collection of short stories. And then I had to go back and relace the entire thing together. And the only thing that would have made that happen was just an insane amount of world building and character building,
Okay. Uh-huh.
and rewriting. So this book has probably been written at least I would say 40 times
Oh, wow. Okay.
to be the version that it is today.
Right, right. I had kind of a similar experience with my first book where I wrote it and then realized like, oh, this is more like book two. And so then I went and wrote book one afterwards. And then I was like, I'm going to rewrite book two anyway. Because I was like, you learn so much writing book one that you're like, okay, I need to rewrite this anyway. So book one actually got written a couple of times before it was its final version as well. Now, do you find that you're someone who like has like a special time of day to write or writes at a certain time, like has like a schedule for your writing?
If I could choose a time of day,
Yeah,
it would definitely be either early, early morning or late, late night. I love
right.
the like transition into day and
Mhm.
into the evening. That's my favorite time to write. However, I work 40 plus hours every week.
Yes. Mhm.
Um, I am on a marketing team. So,
Oh.
because of that, I spend a ton of my time writing dictation in the car and racing around like crazy.
Mhm.
And also having to stay active, of course, on social media. With all of
Mhm.
that, it kind of just happens whenever it can. One of the biggest things people in the Discord, because we have an authors Discord, a young indie author Discord for anyone watching. Um, the people in the Discord often ask me, they'll say, "Do you have any tips for getting into writing and like making sure that you stay through it?" Because they hear
Yeah.
that I've been writing it for 10 years on my social media, and they're like, "How?
Right.
How did you do that?" And the really only answer is that I never stop thinking about it. I am
Mm.
like, even when I'm working on something else, I'm still thinking about it. So I think that's a big part of it is just remember where you are, where you left off, and just think about it as much as you can when you're in the
Right.
shower, when you're in the car, when you're in all those waiting in between periods of your day, waiting to get coffee, waiting to get
Mhm.
lunch. All of those times you can definitely be thinking about your book. And then as soon as you get ready to sit on the paper, there's no writer's block. You just go straight.
Yeah. I think it helps to kind of have an idea of like either where you want to go for that session today
Mhm.
or like what you want to do in that accomplish in that session can really help with writer's block. Like I always sit down with a goal in mind of like I'm going to introduce this plot device or develop this character or whatever, and that really helps me to not get as blocked because I think it can be really intimidating if you just sit down and like stare at paper or a screen and just be like, okay, now words. Like
I agree.
it can be very daunting because you're just like if you don't know what you have in mind for that chapter or scene, then it can just be like, okay, now what happens? And so that's really helped me. Um, Tell us a little bit about book one before we like continue about writing processes. I want to hear about We Who Paved the Milky Way.
Right. So, I mean, the general premise is that we are in a future where humanity has been conquered, and the conquering species has um, decided to take their bodies to use them to achieve immortal life. So humanity is almost treated like cattle.
Mhm.
And then the best of those bodies are chosen, and then they're kind of like almost like a body snatcher type feel.
Okay.
And so the main character grows up in this very dystopian society. I would say is very morally gray almost from the beginning. And there are moments where he has to travel in this memory stream to
Mhm.
see how we made mistakes throughout history as humans.
Right.
And also when the Lavindians, which are the conquering species, end up um, coming in and defeating them. And that's kind of where the story takes place, and it goes back to him in the memory stream and then coming out of the memory stream and interacting with his found family, and it weaves a whole tale kind of back and forth through time. And that's
That's super. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I love how you explained it when you were brainstorming and like kind of writing it the first time, that it was kind of these different short stories that ended up being weaved into one big story.
right.
I love that kind of writing style. Personally, like even in nonfiction, I love like a good braided essay, like that weaving in of like different parts that somehow becomes one cohesive piece in the end. I know you said you're working on your second book. So do you find that your writing process has changed from like book to book, or yeah, tell us about it. Yeah.
Massively. And it's funny that you say that because I'm actually working on this is I joke on my social media, it's
Mhm.
a secret, but it's
Right.
kind of not. Um,
Not
that's
so
kind of
secret.
that's
Yeah.
kind of the joke. I'm always like, "Shh, you don't know
Right.
this," but, like, obviously I'm telling them. So I am actually working on my second and my third book, and even the differences between
Hmm.
the 2. So the second book, is the sequel to this.
Right.
And for that one, I had to do intense world building because for
Mm-hmm.
one, it had to tag off from each like line that I didn't leave finished from the
Right.
last one. And also, originally in this book, I had written it almost as like a morose type feel at the end, and it was
Right.
intended to be a standalone. And I left it, and
Hmm.
my friends started reading it, and they finished it, and they said, "When's the next one?" And I was like, "No, like,
Yeah.
it just ends that way." And they're like, "Oh, absolutely no, not it does not. Like,
Not a lot. Yeah.
not an option." And so I got to go on this whole journey. I'm actually very thankful that they said that because I fall in love with these characters. Um, but because of that, I had to be very, very, very intense about the world building for this one.
Mm.
And that leaked into the third one. And I had to go back even in the final stages of development of the first one and add a bunch of scenes so that it would bleed into the next one.
Right. Right.
So that is one of the biggest things. The new book that I'm working on is a sci-fi romantic comedy.
Oh,
And
that sounds
this
so
one I get
fun.
to be so fun and flowy
Mhm.
with. And I love messing around with this one because the characters are impulsive. And I feel like I can be impulsive.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of just sitting down, knowing where I left off, thinking of this silly, ridiculous thing to
Right.
happen.
Mhm.
Almost in a parallel style kind of between Rory, I think it's destroys the multiverse or something like that. How Rory
Okay.
Thorne
Mhm.
destroys the multiverse, and like between Pirates of the Caribbean and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy,
Oh,
and
that sounds so fun.
all that mashed together.
Right.
And when I sit down, I just kind of go. And
Yeah.
that one, it just comes really easily. It's already more than halfway through, and it's been only
Yeah.
a few months, so.
Yeah, I can tell you're really like passionate about your books and your projects. And I really love that because I think that definitely translates into your writing, I'm sure. And like, so do you find like, I know you say you write like you kind of dabble all across the sci-fi genre, but do
Mhm.
you like find that you have like a different process for writing like short stories versus a novel?
I For short stories,
Hmm.
I don't plan a single thing. I just
Same.
touch the keys, and I love to listen to music at the same time as I type. And
Hmm.
then if it's the right song, I
Right.
feel like the sound of my keys like starts to like meld with the music, and
Yeah.
then I feel like I go into a trance, and like 2 hours later it's done. So I'm
Nice.
not very
Yeah.
helpful when it comes to that for advice.
Right. Well, it makes sense though because I'm kind of a very similar. Whereas, like, I do like the whole plotting thing with a novel, and then a short story. I'm like, okay, I had this idea, and then I just kind of start writing rather than
Mhm.
getting into like all of the plotting, and doing all that. Um, so I think that that's probably really common for short stories to be more of like a pantsing thing, just because they are short, so you don't need as much world building because you're trying to do more with less words, right? So
Yeah.
um Do you have a preference? Like, do you like writing short stories better, or do you like writing novels better?
The problem is every time I write a short story, it turns into a novel.
I think that's a problem a lot of us writers have. I hear that all the time from people where they're just like, yeah, this idea was supposed to be just something small, and now I'm like, have to expand it. And yeah, I think it's just like, it's so hard not to fall in love with your characters and like not to keep writing like more about them. Like, I know when I ended my first series, I was just like, I don't want to be done with these characters, even though the story's done, just because you like fall in love with the story and stuff. So then I was like, same universe, different characters. We're doing another series. So I definitely can relate to that. What tips do you have for others who may be either like beginning finding their writing process or like maybe refining it? For like for me, I just say like try everything, because I think that even if you're like, oh, I know I'm a pantser, or I know I'm this or that, like you can really like learn about yourself by like pushing past your comfort zone. Because I used to be like a diehard pantser. I was just like, I cannot plot. Like if I do, like it'll be the end of the world. But I just like would get writer's block all the time and never finish anything. So then I was just like, okay, we obviously like I want to finish this novel, because I had like 5 novels I'd started and like abandoned along the way, like little graveyard of stories. So I was just like, okay, like I need to like refine my process and really find something that works for me. And so I was like desperate, so I was like willing to try something different, and then I was like, oh my gosh, this actually works for me. So like, what tips do you have for people in that process?
Well, I think one of the biggest tips I always tell people is just if you feel like something's not working or
Mhm.
you feel uncomfortable with how your flow is, no matter whether you're a pantser or a plotter, um, if you feel like your flow isn't right, there's
Mm.
a good chance that you haven't done enough character development.
Oh.
Um, and because a lot of the time you'll be like, oh, there's a pause here. What
Mhm.
do they say? What do they do in this pause? And that pause is typically where the action has died down and they're waiting to build the action again.
Okay.
And
Mhm.
in all those moments, to me, is usually that moment where they get confused is the moment where you're trying to make people fall in love with the characters. It's where
Right.
the characters can joke along. It's like where there's some dialogue, where there's the
Right.
character in their natural state, where they're not constantly bombarded with whatever's happening in their world.
Right.
And to be fair, we all look our best when that's not happening.
Mm.
So my advice is always just no matter what you're doing, make sure your characters are so thoroughly developed that when you get to the pauses, there's no pauses. Like you just know instinctually what your character would be doing. And if it feels like you can't, withdraw and say, okay, what would my character do on a day off? What
Right.
would they do in a pause? How would they act? Who do they joke with? Who would they
Right.
go see? And that's kind of how you can move from there. Um, that's my biggest one.
I love that. I want to call back to something you said earlier, because it's something that I try to do as well. When I'm, figuring out my characters, I always like to think about like what is their relationship with the other characters, because I feel like so many books they like want to have this bond between the characters, like and their best friend or the sidekick or the whatever is going, the love interest, but they don't necessarily spend the time on the page developing that relationship. And so it's like it feels like contrived, or it's like missing that depth, because like the characters, I'm like, okay, they've been together on 10 pages of the story maybe, with everything else that's going on, but like all of a sudden they're best buds. Like, when did that happen? Like, I love seeing that process in the story. And so I think that's like a really great tip for people, is to think about like what is their character relationship between other characters and how they interact with them, and like showing that, because we always say like if it doesn't push the story forward, don't include it, but like unless is character development. I feel
Right.
like is a big
For sure.
caveat to that. Um, and then I did want to ask, like, what is your favorite part about writing? Like, what do you love about the writing experience and process?
Um, that's a really good question. Um, I think I have just always felt with
Mhm.
writing that it was the only way that I could 120% express myself with no fear that I hadn't done that properly.
Okay.
And so my favorite thing about it is that you can convey your existence
Hmm.
in an existence that isn't your own. And in a relatable way that other people are like, this is me.
Hmm.
One thing that I really hold dear to me about this character that I wrote, his name is Jacob, um, is that he is anxious.
Okay.
There's a moment in the beginning where the the big start of the story eventful moment
Hmm.
happens and he breaks down. He
Right.
doesn't have one of those, I am the hero, I am coming to like save the day. Like
Right.
that doesn't happen. He breaks down and when he's ready, he takes on what he can.
Mm.
And it is an anti-hero story. And he does grow and makes decisions that we probably wouldn't. And he is a complicated, darker, complex character. And I felt that a lot of the things that he would do, a lot of feelings he had, a lot of people say that they feel like when they're reading him, that they're reading their own thoughts. And that's
Mm.
very much how I wanted it to feel, like the anxious thoughts, the sad thoughts, the
Right.
thoughts that we don't want to talk about with other people. The questions that he would be asking in this world are very much the questions that I feel that other people would be asking. And
Yeah.
so that's what I like about writing is making my world, my
Mm.
inner world,
Hmm.
become somebody else's inner world and feeling less alone for it.
Yeah. I love that about, like, I constantly talk about like languages and things like that, because I find it fascinating, because it's like really like we make random noises or we scribble symbols on a page and someone else reads it, and we're conveying like concepts and like emotions and all these big things, but we're able to share like our inner world with other people through language and communication. And it's just like it's a fascinating like magic superpower I think that
I
everyone
always felt
has.
that way.
I love it because it's just like such an insane, like when you think about it, it's just like this wild like idea that like I can talk about, how I feel with someone else and they can completely understand and relate to it, even though we're two different individual people. And there's this kind of like universality to it that I just love about language and communicating and words and the power of words. So I really love that you brought that up as your favorite part of writing, because I'm like, yes, that connection that you get with a reader that you never know, may never meet, but like still you're connecting on a human level. Um, why do you think it is so important to know and understand your writing process as a writer, like for other writers?
I think it's important because the more you understand what your writing process is, the more you know what to do next in your cycle.
Hmm.
So, for example, I spoke about earlier how if I feel like I'm hitting kind of a dead end, it's
Right.
probably because I haven't character built. So I just go back.
Okay. Hmm.
And then if I feel like the character building is hard, it's probably because I haven't done enough defining the world. And
Oh,
so I
okay.
just keep going back steps. And then I move forward
Right.
every single time that I feel like I have been successful. And
Okay.
then eventually I'll pass back through. And I feel like a lot of people get writer's block and they're just so defeated by it. And that's just so
Hmm.
sad because they have these amazing ideas and I'm sure they could have an absolutely amazing ending, but they just feel almost like it's an impossibility. And
Right.
knowing your writing process will help you to understand where you need to go back to move forward.
Why you got stuck, right? Yeah, I had someone explain writers to me once before, then they explained it as like, usually if you get writer's block, it's because you're trying to force the story to go in a direction that's not natural
Mm.
for the story. So you're trying to like push it through, and it's stuck because it's not something that like should be happening in the story, or it's not where the story is like wanting to go. um so I really love asking other people about their experience with writer's block and kind of how they get past it. um One thing that I love asking people about is like, where do they find their inspiration? Like, what inspires you? Like, where do you get all your story ideas from? Or like, when you're having like writer's block or a dry spell, like, what do you do to kind of spur creativity in yourself?
Yeah, so honestly, the best way to
Mhm.
get for me to inspire me is to be around other people. Sometimes all I want to do is write, but what I actually need to go do is live
Yeah.
because you can't write what you haven't experienced. Like, of course, I say that as a sci-fi writer who's writing other worlds, but it's
Right.
still a character who's experienced this. Um, the oppression that I wrote in this dystopian novel is very much felt and based off of feelings that I've had.
Hmm.
So in a way, I did write what I felt, but metaphorically.
Right.
And when it comes to writing friendships, when it comes to writing sibling relationships, which is something I've always struggled with as an only child, um,
Hmm.
you have to be around siblings. You have to be around
Right.
friends.
Right.
Families, you have to be around them. Good, bad, doesn't matter. And the experiences that you've had with families and whether they're good or bad interactions, if they're
Right.
changed and melded and that same representation is shown through a character, I think whatever experience you've had is going to come across more genuine and
Mhm.
more relatable to the reader.
Right.
So, regardless, going out and experiencing things and then writing them. Sometimes I will go to a coffee shop and I won't actually write. I'll just sit there and I'll drink my coffee and I'll just listen. I'll
I
listen.
was gonna ask, are you a people watcher? Yeah.
I'll listen to the conversations in the booth next to me
Right.
and
Mhm.
and I know it's not right to eavesdrop, but as a writer,
I think we all are a little guilty of
little
eavesdropping. Yeah, because I mean, it's so important though, because like when you're writing dialogue and you want it to sound natural, like it won't unless you have practiced listening to
right.
how conversations like naturally develop, or like I've seen some really interesting discourse on conversations like between like neurotypicals and neurodivergent people. And like it's so fascinating because like one subset of people will be like asking questions, and so the other
Mhm.
person like won't they want to talk about something, but they won't divulge more information until you like ask them about it and then seem interested. Whereas like other people will be like, oh, I want to share a story of like how I relate to that because this happened to me. And so it's like it's so interesting, but like yeah, you kind of have to like listen and experience these different types of conversations to really be able to like replicate them in any meaningful way. So
I
I
completely agree with that.
yeah, so I think a lot more of us are people watchers and eavesdroppers than we admit to.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I think that we're all definitely a little guilty of
Watch
it.
out for authors. We're like peeking around trees at you
Right, with the
through the
with
blinds.
the binoculars and the blinds, yeah, like, "What's going on in the world out there? I gotta write a story." We have a question from the audience, it looks like, so, if you wanna go ahead and share that, Joe. So how do you find out what your book is? Is that a part of the writing process as well?
Oh, that's such a good question.
It is a really great question.
Um, I think the most important thing about
Mhm.
finding out what your book is what story do you have to offer to the world?
Right.
What experiences do you have? Know yourself. Um, you have to have a little bit of confidence in yourself to be able to have a conversation with someone about what you've experienced.
Mhm.
A lot of people will say, "Oh, well, I've kind of had like a boring life. Like I don't have much to tell." That's not true. Everyone's the main character of their own story. I always
Yes.
hated that trend on TikTok and Instagram where it's like, this is the main character, or like, she's definitely the main character. Because to
Right.
me, everyone's the main character, everyone's a side character. That's just how it
Right.
is.
Mhm.
And I think that's the most important thing, is that you have to know exactly who you are and what kind of story you can tell. For me, um, my story, quite honestly, talks from a very oppressed place
Mhm.
when I was younger. Um, it talks about mental health.
Right.
There are slight notes, especially in the second book, that talks on sexism.
Mhm.
There are notes that talk about um, even slightly on physical abuse. You probably wouldn't notice it because it's more metaphorical, but that's there as well. So because those are things that I felt were part of my story, I turned that into a sci-fi world, but that
Right.
is definitely the places where that comes from.
Mhm.
So it would depend what kind of adventure have you had,
Right.
um, and then that's where you belong. That's where your writing process should start.
Right. I definitely agree that when we think about like the thematic bits of our story, like what is the general story you're trying to tell? Is it that love conquers all, or it doesn't have to be necessarily like a moral, or like when you think of like
Mhm.
a children's tale where it has like a very clear listen to your parents and don't go in the woods, kind of theme. But like themes can be like a number of things, but it all boils down to like, what is the story I want to tell right now, to that I think someone else needs to hear, or I think that the world needs to hear. And that's a really great place to start to figure out like what is important to you and what is important for you to share with other people, either because you wish you had known when you were younger, or because you think like people just need to be reminded about, like, I love to write characters who do like what is right versus what's easy, finding that like everyday courage or that everyday magic in yourself. So that's usually like this type of story that I'm trying to tell, is that it's not easy, but I'm going to help my friends, right? Or it's not easy, but I'm going to do this or that, because that's what I feel is the right thing to do. And I love writing characters like that. Um,
It's kind of the opposite of me. I like
right.
to write more like morally gray characters
Hmm.
who have come from a certain self and
Right.
manage to push forward in their own way that may never be anybody else's ideal, but
Right.
that shows growth,
Hmm.
and shows strength, and then also just tell an entertaining story as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that because it's like your theme is more about like staying true to yourself and who you are.
Mhm.
What we talk about morals, but it's like everyone has a code of morals. It's not always
Right.
the same. They don't match with
Absolutely.
other people's. I mean, I love reading about all kinds of different characters. Um, I just find myself, like I said, I think drawn more to, like I said, when I think of like everyday courage or something like that.
Oh, I love
Uh,
those stories too. One of my favorites. I don't
yeah.
know if you've ever watched like the anime Fruits Baskets, with the main character, her
No, I
like
haven't.
positive, like push through attitude. I'm obsessed.
I've heard so many good things about that. I have to watch it. I think that's going to be
She's
on my
so
watch
good. If
next
you
list.
like that type of character, you'd really like her.
All right, I'm taking mental notes in my head. Like I need to watch this anime because yeah, I've heard so many good things about it. What writing advice do you like to give to like baby authors, or like people even if they've been writing for a while? Like what's your favorite writing advice?
I think the biggest thing is just keep writing.
Mhm.
And also the first thing you write is not the final thing you write.
Yeah.
So if you write something and you're super passionate about it and you really feel like it's the story you want to tell, and then you read it back and you're like, "Oh, but it's not as good as Pride and Prejudice." Like, my
Right.
romance isn't as good as my favorite book out there by a very famous author course it's not. It's your
Right.
first thing. It's your first draft, maybe even.
Mhm.
And that's not the expectation. The expectation is to find your voice, not
Right.
to compare yourself with others,
Right.
and to find your audience. And I think a lot of baby authors out there are terrified of that. They're really
Right. Mhm.
scared of putting themselves out there, and they'll see their writing and they'll say, well, it's not the quality of this author. It's not the quality
Right.
of that
Mhm.
author. And I'm not Isaac Asimov. I'll never be him. I'm not H.G.
Right.
Wells.
Right. Yeah.
But I do tell my own version of the story, and that's what I have to improve. Just me,
Yes.
nobody else.
Yes. Yes. Totally agree. Right. I think it's human nature to have like this idea of like we've got to compare ourselves to other people, but it's like really we should only be comparing ourselves to like who we were yesterday rather than like
Absolutely.
feeling like because I think you can learn something from like all types of writing, right? Like how yeah. Yeah, totally understand that feeling. I think that like reading romances, you can learn about how to develop relationships or that slow burn or the fast burn, like whatever you prefer. But like every genre and every writer can teach us something different. I know we both love Pride and Prejudice, and
Yeah.
one of the things I love about her writing in particular is like she takes these everyday events and makes it so like dramatic and
Entertaining,
entertaining, and like you're just like riveted reading about
comical.
like a tea party, and you're just like, how am I so into this tea party? Like, but you're just like, is Darcy gonna get to talk to her? And then that lady's like, no, we must keep the gentleman away. And I'm just like, no, let them talk, you know. So um I totally agree with what you're saying. Don't mind my side rant. I love to ask this question to people. So I know you write sci-fi across the genre. Do you read only sci-fi, or do you find yourself reading something completely different? Yes.
Absolutely not. Um, so no, I have a bookstagram, and on it you can see there's nothing that's the same. Like
Right,
it's like
right.
mysteries, thriller, like over here there's like romance, like
Mhm, mhm.
fantasy. I'm all over the place. I actually I'm probably just as in love with fantasy romance as everybody else.
Right.
I think everyone is just enthralled with fantasy romance right now.
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
gotten the genre has really taken off from where it was.
Right.
And I love web comics as well. A good like romantic web comic is always they have the cutest rom-coms out there. And I
They
just
do.
love
Those all the meet cutes and the special little moments between them. Yeah, well, comics are great.
it.
We have another question from the audience. So, how would you stay focused in another environment other than home? So, this person struggles with staying focused in other places than their space. Um, and something is it something that's learned over time?
Um, I think that depends a lot on the person.
Hmm.
Um, My best suggestion is to find music.
Yeah.
And if you can get music and kind of plug yourself out, that helps a lot. I also like to try to find a spot where I'm comfortable physically,
Mm.
even if I'm not even if there's tons of distractions around. So that there's still like I'm sitting comfortably. I found a spot that is comfortable for me. I'm not feeling anxious. And that is a good starting place when you're out somewhere. Another thing is to not get mad at yourself for being distracted.
Right. Hmm.
Sometimes if I'm distracted, seeming on my laptop rather than getting frustrated with it, I pull out a notebook and I just start doodling until something comes, and I'll start drawing maybe a scene, or maybe I'll just do something that'll refocus my attention and pull me back into the book rather than concerned about what's on the outside. I feel like if you're forcing it really hard,
Hmm.
um, to not be distracted, it might mean that you're not incredibly excited about what you're working on. And of course,
Right.
it's hard to be focused if it's extremely loud or something like that. But if you can use music, if you can be really excited about what you're working on, or if you can change your medium if you're not,
Mhm.
Those are all tips. And then another one would be if you're having a hard time writing, to do more plotting. And I know not everyone's a plotter, so they might hate that tip. But
Right.
sometimes if you do that, at least you feel like you've gotten work done. And then when the next quiet period comes, you can take everything you've done and drift it on paper. So that's something I do a lot.
Yeah, I think it is really important to be comfortable. People can do like different like writing rituals too to kind of get into that mindset of writing. So for me, like you, a big part of it is like listening to certain music or like having my
Mhm.
earbuds in and just like getting into the mindset of like, okay, now it's time to write. I'm gonna like I listen to music because I'd be too distracted by the outside world if I didn't, even at home. But yeah, like, having like a special drink you have for your writing time, literally wearing your writer hat, like, yeah, yeah. Everyone's got
My
little
favorite.
cues that, like, little cues that help you get into the right mindset, would be my advice for that. What is
Mhm.
your biggest influence when it comes to writing? Like, what or who?
My biggest influence is probably my emotions.
Yeah.
I definitely write to what I'm feeling at the
Mhm.
time. I find it difficult if I'm not already feeling an emotion to write certain scenes. And sometimes I'll even like make myself a certain emotion if I'm not
Right.
quite there. I have different playlists that are set to each emotion if I'm like struggling. But I do find it really necessary to have whatever the emotion is, and then I feel inspired to write. For example, if I'm angry, I usually the way I describe anger in my book is the literal, at least from my main character's perspective, is the literal symptoms that I'm having.
Right.
Um, and then it feels accurate because most of us experience anger at least in a somewhat similar way.
Right. Right.
And so that's a big inspiration for me. Of course, I'm also inspired by the people in my life. A lot of my characters, their names or the places in my book are just like anagrams of people in my life's names.
Oh, I love that.
Sometimes the whole thing is just like switched around in different ways. Sometimes they might get a letter chopped off and it's switched around, but in general, there's tons of them that are like that.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Those like little Easter egg clues for people. Um, and then we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you. This is one of my favorite questions to ask my guest: is what writing advice do you hate?
I really hate any
Mhm.
writing advice that tells you that there's one way to write.
Yes.
Um, I get this one ad on my YouTube all the time that's like the hardest thing about writing is the people around you. Like the people around you distracting you. And I'm like, that is not the hardest thing
Right.
about writing.
Right.
And then the next thing they say is make sure you write for an hour a day. And
Yes.
I also can't stand that advice
Hmm.
because sometimes the writing is not there. Sometimes the plotting is there. Sometimes just thinking about it is there, doodling about it. But just
Hmm.
to force someone to sit and write every day, oh my goodness, that's ridiculous.
Right. And that's not taking neurodivergency into mind,
Oh,
I feel like,
absolutely not.
because yeah, that is something that is a struggle for a lot of people. It looks like we have one more question from the audience, so I did want to get to that. What was the hardest part of getting your book published?
Um, so I don't always talk a lot about this, but
Hmm.
when I was publishing my book, I started the publishing process during the pandemic.
Right.
Um, and I was working 40 hours of an unpaid internship
Oh,
in college. And I had to work 20 plus additional hours on the weekend to pay to exist as a human.
hmm.
Um, and then, of course, I gathered all of my money together. I had probably around $2,300
Hmm.
and I bought an editor, I bought the cover art and all of that and self-funded it myself. To me, that was the hardest part.
Right.
I was exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no
Being
way to
indie
work
is not
60+
easy.
hours a
Yeah.
week and not be exhausted.
Yeah, being
It's
indie is
not.
not the easiest way. I think it is very meaningful. I think it is very worth it, but being indie is not easy because everything is time or money, right? It's the
Mhm.
time to figure out how to do it and do it on your own, or it's the money to delegate the task. Like for me, I'm like, I cannot format to save my life. Like that type of really like nitpicky, like unless I'm hyper focusing on something I love, like I do
Mhm.
not have the ability to sit and be like, let me find all the spaces and stuff. um so that's something that like I would delegate to other people, but it is a struggle because when you're doing everything on your own, you're doing everything on your own. So I definitely would say like that is a very hard part in publishing. Another hard part to publishing is just like getting the story done, right? Like finishing the story. Like I hear all the time everyone's like, oh, I have this story in me, but I never have the time. And that's really like a big limitation for a lot of people, is sitting down and having the perseverance to get it all out.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, you can't just make art, right? Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's so much inherent value in art, but it's hard to
Mhm.
just be like sit and produce it, right? So, I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of struggles in publishing, but it's definitely worth it, in the
And
end.
just as one last little thing, it's
Mhm.
also the knowledge that as an indie author, when you publish, that's just the beginning.
Right,
You haven't marketed it probably
right.
very much yet, and then there's the reviews and everything else that comes after in the next one. It's not
Mhm.
done. It continues, and that's
Right, right.
exhilarating and the hardest part in some ways.
Right. It is hard, but oh my gosh, that wonderful feeling you get the first time you hold like a physical copy of your book in your hands. Can't beat that with anything.
Nope.
Um, so we are at the end of our time together. I do want to ask, like, where can we find you on social media? If there's anything that you want to like announce, any secret projects or anything that you want to talk about, now's your time. So where can we find you?
Absolutely. So, on TikTok, I'm at Hal Arnold Author. On Instagram, I talk about books and anything that's happening, and that's at Hal underscore Arnold underscore author. I have a lot of projects going on. First, there's this book, then there's the sequel of this book, and then my sci-fi romantic comedy book, which is in the process as well. I'm also going to be working eventually on a collab project for a sci-fi romantic comedy podcast, kind of like a
Nice.
story podcast. So I've got all of that stuff going on. Lots of things.
Yeah, that I mean, that's great. I love a person who keeps busy because I don't know when to stop sometimes either. Yeah, no, science fiction romance podcast sounds amazing. I will definitely be keeping my eye out for more information on that, so I can listen in. You can find me at hijinkswriter.com. My socials are hijinkswriter on most platforms except for TikTok, where it's Ginny and Tonic. That's JINNY and Tonic. And you can find me here on Go Indie Now for In Progress. I'm here every first Monday of the month, and also with my podcast with Elle Bachman, where we do the Young People podcast and talk about horror stories. So, because I'm random and I like to write about YA or horror or something random. So, thank you so much for joining us. It was really wonderful to have you on, Hal, and it's always time to go indie now. So we'll see you